Hello and welcome to the SafeBreach and ASMGi webinar. Today we'll be discussing patch less, protect more, prioritizing vulnerabilities that can actually be exploited. We will be waiting just a couple minutes, let people trickle in and get their audio set up before we get this kicked off. All right, thank you everybody for waiting. So we will now get started. So with that, I will pass it over to Steve.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Thank you to all the attendees for sharing some of your time with us today. Just really an awesome topic to talk about. This is something that I think we're likely all challenged with, right? And we have a great panel of experts to really kind of dig in on this topic. So today we're gonna talk about vulnerability management, but not just vulnerability management. Specifically, how do you prioritize what vulnerabilities to remediate, right? And it's a great, relevant, timely topic. I think the concept in general about what we're going to talk about is risk-based vulnerability management. This is kind of a newer, hot topic today. So I think it's really a relevant topic, and very excited to be here. So I have a great panel of experts today, and just real quick, I'll do a quick introduction and then just let you guys kind of talk a little bit about yourself. But I'm Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGi. With me today is Dave Armstrong, the CISO of the Judge Group, and Peter Ritter, the Director of Worldwide MSSP and Channel Programs at SafeBreach, and Mansoor Raza from the Solutions Engineer from SafeBreach. So why don't you, Dave, go ahead and just tell us a little bit about yourself and
sure,
and the Judge Group, and then we'll
Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. I am David Armstrong, the CISO of the Judge Group. We are a staffing company based in the United States with operations in China, India, and Canada. At any one time, we have between 5,500 and 7,500 active contractors out working in the world. We focus primarily on technology and staffing, but we also have a consulting division, a training division, and we have a permanent placement division. So globally, we have about 750 internal employees, and as I said, anywhere up to 7,000 active contractors at any one time.
Awesome. Peter?
Yeah, my name is Peter Ritter, and I run the partner program. SafeBreach is located in California, and we also have a team in Israel. And we have a great platform that can simulate attack methods to help improve your security.
Excellent. Mansoor?
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join our call this morning or this afternoon. Like Steve said, my name is Mansoor Raza. I'm the Senior Solutions Engineer with SafeBreach. Just a bit about myself. I've been in the security space for over 18 years, covering all different aspects from security information management, identity management, endpoint security, and have been with SafeBreach from breach attack simulation. Thank you again for your time.
Awesome. Yeah, and thank you guys. Thanks very much for being here. And I mentioned earlier, we have just a tremendous amount of content. I think it's all relevant and good. Before we get started, SafeBreach, by the way, Peter and Mansoor are going to really kind of dig and do a deep dive into how to address the concept of risk-based vulnerability management. Before we get started, though, I thought, Dave, you have an incredible organization. You're doing staffing for companies that, in all industries, they have all kinds of compliance requirements to meet and various different things. It's critical that you address vulnerability management. And I'm just curious, like how do you do it? Right? You're fighting the good fight every single day. How do you accomplish these things? And, what kind of challenges do you face specifically with vulnerability management?
Well, the challenges we face are pretty obvious. How do you protect your systems from, the threat vectors that are out there? So we have what we believe to be, a well-established, industry-recognized patching program in place. I'm not going to obviously say what it is, but, I believe a lot of people use this, and you would be wise to use this system too. That system, then, what it does is it presents us with lists of choices. It goes out and it scans and it looks for all the CVEs and it brings them back and it says, here's what we can apply. And we look at things holistically. We say, okay, the 0 days obviously go first. After that is the critical OSs go. After that is the critical hardware patches go. And after that is the recommended patches go. But where we struggle is the engineering team here, they look at this as a robust system. But the developers here look at this as a nuisance, and they look at this as it's complete overkill. You guys are just carpet bombing systems. So that's where, Steve, when we started to talk, we started to look at how do we become better at assigning the level of risk, what's out in the wild, how does that apply to my systems, and reduce the carpet bombing from let's just throw all the patches, all the CVEs are out there, regardless of the CVSS score, and let's just have a patching frenzy every other Tuesday. And then what we'll do is we'll increase the frequency of our pen testing. Okay, we're no longer going to just pen test twice a year. Now we're going to pen test once a month. Okay, now we're no longer going to patch just once a month. Now we're patching twice a month. So what we're seeing is an increase in activity, and we need to be smarter. We've come to this decision. We need to be smarter about how we patch. Do we patch? Yes. Do we patch in a smart fashion where we're not disrupting the business of the developers and not running pen tests every week? So ultimately, this is the problem that we have to solve. I'm in the camp now where if it's labeled as a critical OS or a hardware, you push it out there straight away. Maybe not always the best choice, as it may be not applicable. So that's kind of the challenge that we face.
Yep, well said. Yeah, well said. And we do a lot of vulnerability management programs for enterprises, and I think the challenges are widespread and shared really among a lot of folks, and that is just the volume. I mean, the volume of remediation is so much, and how do you do it all, right? You have to have some mechanism in place to figure out what to do next.
I think the key term, Steve, is insight. That's what I'm looking for. With a product that can give me the insight into what I should be doing in an intelligent fashion. Yeah. That to me solves a lot of problems.
Well, that sums it up really well, Dave, quite honestly. And I can tell you that our vision and our goal 100% of the times is to give you and people just like you the information that you need to make good business decisions. So that said, let's kick it over to SafeBreach, and Peter and Mansoor can drill in a little bit on, how do we actually do this, right? So, Peter?
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to Dave also. Yeah, I mean, definitely there's a lot of different ways and challenges with vulnerability management. And we'll talk a little bit about how maybe we can help with that insight and help and other organizations too with that. Before we go too deep into that, did want to spend a little bit of time kind of level setting and talking about the process. Personally, I actually ran a vulnerability management service back in the early 2000s. And had to deal with these same kind of issues. And so let's kind of go for the kind of the 4 stages and the 4 kind of concerns with that race you have to do every month to kind of get those patches out there. Looking at this chart, it also reminds me of the chart for malware, right? The increase of things that are going out there. Same thing is happening with vulnerabilities. over the last couple of years, that has just grown. And it's great that manufacturers are addressing the holes in their product, but the volume is just crazy. And it kind of makes me very thankful that I'm no longer in this providing this service anymore. From 2004 to about 2012, I kind of had it easy, I guess, because I was only doing about 7,000 to 8,000 patches, whereas today that's 3 times the number. So it's a big volume of data that's out there. And what do I do first, right? And it kind of goes back to what Dave was saying. What kind of insight should I be looking at to help me figure out what I should take care of first? The other kind of component to this, though, is that while the number of vulnerabilities are increasing, the time that exploits are coming out is decreasing. Again, creating a 0 day is not something easy. And, according to this chart, we still got a lot of 0 days going out there and things getting taken advantage right away. But a lot of hackers, though, are lazy. And, they don't want to put all this work into there. They're doing this to make money. So a lot of the hackers out there is like, this is great when a vulnerability gets released because they know that people can't patch fast enough. And all the details that they need are in there. So when Microsoft or Adobe releases something, they know where the holes are. And now half of the work for them is done. So now they can kind of go out there and they can take advantage of that and they don't have to work as hard. So just a few years ago, you would have about a month to kind of get these patches out there before you were at risk. That's just going down and down. And now you have a week, maybe 2 weeks at most, before somebody has something out there that can take advantage of this. Very scary and puts a lot more urgency against the larger number of vulnerabilities that are out there. So that means, okay, how many patches can I deploy? What am I going to deploy every month? And so we've done some surveys, and it's kind of scary that 40% only patch about 10 of them. To me, that sounds like they're doing the Microsoft patches only. That's about what comes out every month from Microsoft on average. But there are patches for a lot of different products. When I was doing this in the 2000s, it was Adobe Reader and Flash Player, but Java updates and things like that. Again, there's so many things out there, and they're not also released at the same time. They're not kind of scheduled that way. So when you see something like this where almost half are only doing less than 10 patches, that's kind of scary. And there's a good group here, about another third that are doing 10 to 50, but there can be a lot more patches out there depending on what's going on in your environment. So you got to take that into consideration. There's, again, only so much time, and we can see that a lot of people are not pushing out all the patches. Then the other kind of concern that kind of touches on Dave's point about insight is that, some people are kind of looking at this, and while this looks a little bit encouraging, where you got a third that have some kind of formal process and even multi-level with a rating scale, another third is also doing the same thing, but almost relying on maybe the vendor or some other kind of tool to kind of figure that out. But that's another tool to kind of bring in. Or if they have their own kind of scale, that's another tool or a process they have to add into this. And again, another thing that you have to do before you can even deploy the patches. And are these the right tools? Are these the right ways to really assess for your environment? And how can we get a deeper insight for your environment to really build a better risk of these vulnerabilities and which one to do compared to another one? So in summary, that's kind of the 4 pillars of the management race here, trying to get these patches pushed out, in dealing with the increasing number, but the less time to exploits, giving you a limited ability to determine what you want to patch, and not a lot of insight around that actual risk. So that's where we can come in and help with that, and kind of look at that. And there are different components to this, but definitely looking beyond just the patches and what the vendors are saying is, again, looking at your business, right? Look at my computers. With everybody kind of more doing remote and working from home, your assets now are not behind the firewall. They might be a laptop that has come home, and there's some more vulnerabilities that way. Also looking at this from a business impact, right? If we don't patch this, what is that risk that we're going to take there? What is the chance that we're going to get hit with ransomware or something else in that environment? As I mentioned earlier, there's definitely ways to look at the threat and other tools that can kind of give you that threat context. But what is the threat for your environment, right? It's good to take that information in if you have it, but then you've got to apply it to yours. And then lastly, kind of again, what I mentioned earlier with Microsoft and other vendors do, as they release their patches, they have their critical patches, their recommended patches, and in their critical patches, they do have different severity levels to kind of help you with that. But it's a one size fits all, right? What about your organization? Is it really that same severity that you have compared to somebody else? So then just different components to kind of think about and bring into your risk score. And kind of, we'll come back to this slide in a second too, but just a little bit on that workflow and kind of what has to happen today. And then we'll go a little bit deeper into what we can add to that. So, after a patch comes out, the first thing you got to do though, is you got to scan for those vulnerabilities. You got to figure out, hey, is this actually applied to this particular operating this computer? Does it even need this patch or not? Again, look at that severity of those patches, understand what systems are impacted. Again, if you have some threat intelligence, understand the associated threats with that. So kind of bringing some third-party information that way. And then now you can actually start patching, right? And you can start doing that process. And that's not an easy process. Not like, hey, I'm going to just start patching every day until I'm done. When I was running this, we kind of broke things up into 3 deployment groups, kind of had a beta group of computers, about 20% of an organization's computers, deploy that, see how those things kind of went out. The next night or the next deployment cycle would be to a core group, about 60% of the computers. And then the last 20% would be for a critical. So again, you have to go through these different phases to actually get these patches deployed. So quite a bit of a process and a workflow that's involved in here. Like I said, we'll return to the slide and see how we can help provide some more details around this. But really what we want to talk about here, though, is adding a risk score, right, to the vulnerability management. And quite honestly, it's a simple equation, right? We're looking at the threats, the vulnerabilities that you don't have, and then looking also at the consequence of not patching that in your environment. So we can help with that, right? We can definitely help at SafeBreach with our over 18,000 attack methods. That's going to give you some intelligence around those vulnerabilities. And the way that we do that is that we actually integrate with a vulnerability management tool like a Tenable, a Rapid7, or a Qualys. So we're taking kind of our attack methods that we know, and those are mapped out to the vulnerabilities, and more importantly, to the missing vulnerabilities in your environment, right? And putting that together. With 18,000 attack methods, we've also broken these down into different threat groups, to different attack methods, MITRE framework, so you can also bring that business risk in. Again, I was doing this for banks and credit unions, so maybe I'll be looking at the attacks that maybe Fin8 does on financial institutions, and bring these 3 pieces together in the SafeBreach platform to give you that risk score, to really understand, okay, which one should I be doing? Where's my concern? To kind of give you that priority with vulnerability management. Now, again, breach and attack simulation is what we do at SafeBreach, and it does a lot more. So I just want to touch a little bit on that because it's the same methodology for a lot of different pieces here, right? So we definitely can test your defenses in multiple ways. We can give you that information, right? So you can really understand, okay, where's my concern? What's not working? What can I go to fix that? Again, when it comes back to vulnerabilities, we can kind of give you that priority. And then most importantly here, we have the remediation plans in the product itself, right? So with integrations and other pieces, we can help you actually take those steps, tighten up the firewall so that you know that the particular patch maybe is not a concern. It can be a little bit lower on the priority list, or even look at those patches and figure out which one I should do first or next. Okay. The other advantage of our product is that, two ends actually, we do this safely, right? So Mansoor in a couple of seconds will get into the architecture about how we kind of use a representation model to do this safely in your environment, live in production, but not necessarily on production computers, and also do this continuously. As I mentioned earlier, patches come out on different schedules. So Microsoft has a certain schedule, other vendors have a schedule, there are hot releases of patches. So when it comes to any kind of security that you want to simulate, you can do this continuously with our product as those patches come out, or if you're concerned about certain things, concerned about certain threat groups or a new piece of malware that's coming out. Maybe there's a change in your environment and you want to go out and make sure that that change is working as expected. So a lot of different ways that we can help simulate those attacks above and beyond just vulnerability management. And then again, as we kind of touched on earlier, we also have the ability to help you visualize that, right? We are fully integrated with the MITRE framework, so we can map out to the heat map. We can give you the technique and the sub-techniques that are going on in that with the MITRE attack framework. Again, we have our own risk score in general and the risk score for vulnerability management. And then again, a lot of different ways of looking at the data to make this very easy for you or a partner that's working with you to help you find those gaps, close things up, and report back on that. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Mansoor to go a little bit deeper into the integrations and the architecture of our product. Mansoor?
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for taking the time to join the call. So, like Peter said, right, the SafeBreach platform can, extending the conversation from a visibility perspective, the SafeBreach platform can integrate directly with your controls, your security controls, from endpoint to network and SIEM solution to help validate how well those controls are working. Right, so there's two options, right? Number one, I can integrate directly with your endpoint control, your network control, and correlate and give you the data and saying, hey, was the attack detected? Was it missed? And how well is your control doing? And like Peter said, we can run this on demand or a continuous basis. That's option one. Option two is we can also integrate with your SIEM solution. If you are sending all your controls, your security controls, and their logs to the SIEM solution, we can pick it up from there also. So it's really we have the platform has the capability and the flexibility to provide both options for the customer. What this helps with is it provides you visibility how well your controls are doing, and return on your investment. See how all the money that the companies are spending on safeguarding their data, right? How well the controls are doing. And all of this is done for the SafeBreach platform. It's via an API. The integration is very, very simple to set up. All you need is to enable API access and with an account that has the valid permissions. That's the first aspect, right? From the next thing what I want to talk about is streamline the remediation. So the SafeBreach platform can help you streamline the configuration remediation by integrating directly with the SOAR platforms. So SOAR meaning the security orchestration platforms such as Splunk Phantom, Cortex XSOAR, which used to be known as Demisto. What that will do is we can help automate the process of, we find a gap in your network. With a single click from the results screen of the SafeBreach platform, I can send the results over to your SOAR platform, and if you have a playbook created, it will automate the whole remediation process for you. And that's one aspect, right? Now, furthermore, we already talked about the SIEM solution as integration by investigating the data. We integrate with all the main SIEM players like Splunk, ArcSight, IBM QRadar, and lastly, we can also help from a workflow integration perspective. We can take the simulation results and send it to your ticketing system like ServiceNow. And you know what? I can manually assign that, Peter, please make sure this remediation gets updated and configured or patched and so forth. So the idea is we can help remediate the whole process by automating it or assigning it and becoming part of your workflow also. Next, vulnerability management. Now we've taken a complete different approach, right? We've taken a risk-based approach to vulnerability management. The SafeBreach platform, what Peter mentioned briefly already, is the SafeBreach platform is running all the different simulations in your environment. Now we're capturing all of that data, taking that data and fetching the data from your vulnerability management solution, such as Rapid7, Qualys, or Tenable, and marrying the two data together and providing you a prioritized list on what to patch first. What that really means is, as you know, Peter shared the numbers earlier, there's thousands of vulnerabilities coming out a day. If I were to reduce that number to you and show you in your environment, yeah, there's 1,000 vulnerabilities that came out today, but in your environment, you only need to focus on these 20 or these 10 because those are most exposed in your environment and those are most critical to you. We just cut your work down from like 80, 90%. That's the idea. That's the value the SafeBreach platform is bringing by prioritizing which vulnerabilities to address first. I don't really have time today from a demonstration perspective, but would love to get into a full demonstration for you. This is just a key slide, right? Just showing you from how do we, when we pull in the data, right? When we pull in the data from the vulnerability management solution, this is how we score the vulnerabilities for you. The one thing I want to point out, Maurice, is exposure score or exposure access, right? So we can tell you exactly that based on the vulnerability, if this asset is most exposed, how many steps is away from the outside world. So if this asset is one step away, that's the one you want to focus on first because that's the asset is most exposed. And then we have also the attack surface and the external access score. So these are the different ratings. I'd love to get into a deeper discussion on a demonstration or a later call. So let's talk about the architecture. What you're looking at here is just a brief reference architecture of a typical customer's environment, right? You have different zones in your environment, server zone, user zone, and what I call crown jewels, right? Where all your main data is residing. And then you have your controls and your DMZ zone, right? What the main thing you want to focus on here is, and then you have one of the point is you have different operating systems within those zones also, right? So you need to focus on which asset do I need to prioritize and address first. Before I get into that, right, let's talk about the SafeBreach platform. The SafeBreach platform has two main components. Number one is the SafeBreach Management Console, which can reside, has two deployment options. Number one, it is completely SaaS-based, hosted, and managed by SafeBreach, option one. Option two is on-premise. We support VMware ESX or Xen Server. And now the second component is the actual simulators that are residing in your environment, right? As these symbols come up, these are representations of different simulators that we support. We support all platforms, Windows, Mac, all distributions of Linux, and Docker container. What this overall will present for you, as the simulations are run into your different environments, right? You want to have representation of our simulators in each environment. So because each environment will probably have different controls, different layer of operating systems, and we can help you validate and show you across which control is doing well and where your assets are most exposed and help you prioritize the remediation of your assets. And lastly, I'm going to pass this out and pass it back to Peter to talk and finish about vulnerability management.
Thank you, Mansoor. Thank you for going a little bit deeper into the integrations that we have with vulnerability management and other tools, and going a little bit deeper into the architecture. So yeah, returning to this slide here. So now the workflow has changed a little bit here. So now we're still going to be scanning for vulnerabilities, but with SafeBreach, we can actually simulate attacks and understand, okay, what happens with this vulnerability, right? If certain patch is missing on a computer, and my firewall set up the right way for that particular vulnerability, will it actually block? And that's what we can do with our product. We can actually push out and simulate an attack on your production network safely and understand if it's going to make it to the endpoint or going to get stopped at the firewall level. So now we can add in a more of a priority around that. And we can dive deeper, right? So now not only do we have the vendor's vulnerability severity rule and understand which systems are missing that, you can, again, use your threat feeds to help. We also have integration with threat feeds too, so you can integrate that into our product along with that. But now you have a lot more information around, okay, are these assets actually being able to take advantage of? And how many can be taken advantage of? And really, the key question here, back to the business impact, is that which are the critical systems? Which are the ones for my organization, for my concerns, based on the attack simulation that we ran, tied in with the missing patches, is I'm going to have to worry about the most. And
Hey,
that's
Peter?
how we add in that critical risk score. Yes, Steve?
I have a question for you, and I think it will help to solidify this point, because I think this is incredibly important for people to understand. Can you give an example? And I'm trying to remember where I saw this, if it's on your website or in a piece of collateral or whatever, but you talk about like the difference between a contractor laptop and they only have access to certain information, right? Versus an employee like a CFO laptop who has access to, sensitive data, quite honestly, right? They may both have the same vulnerability present, but an exploit would result in a different outcome on each of those. Can you, that was one of the things that I saw, but can you kind of drill in with an example about, why it's so critical to simulate the attacks and prioritize these vulnerabilities as they show up?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back a little bit to our architecture, right? So the key thing here is to really understand what are your crown jewels. And, definitely the CFO compared to a contractor, the access he or she would have access to would put that into that kind of zone. So it's kind of easy to kind of break, your organization down to zones by operating systems or by servers and users and so forth. But the key thing here is, again, those crown jewels, right? To kind of build up a simulation environment that's going to make sure that we're testing those actual production segments, right? And doing that safely. So now when we're running this and getting that critical score, that's where we can kind of bring in the crown jewel section too, to really understand that, hey, here's a missing patch. They're both vulnerable, but this person is in this segment here that we identified as our crown jewel, and it kind of gives that higher risk concern, and therefore the higher priority to get patched first.
Yep, great. I use, one of the things I use as a metaphor a lot is, like Windows 2003, for example. If a vulnerability scanner finds Windows 2003, it's a 5, just quite honestly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the way that your network is segmented, there may be one system that's found on an internal scan that shows up as a 5 vulnerability, but it's not exploitable, versus a system that is accessible from the outside. It might be vulnerable. So it's critical to, make sure that the patches that are actually exploitable are addressed. And I think that's a critical element of this concept of, prioritization, to make sure you're doing the most critical things first.
Yeah, and that fits in beautifully with the last point on this slide, right? The compensating controls, right? What are all the controls that are in place, the risk that's going along with that? So I know that which systems, I'm patching really the most vulnerable systems first. So let me just wrap up with the last 2 slides, and then we can go into Q&A. So again, what we're bringing here with the SafeBreach platform and our integrations is bringing in that threat intelligence from our own almost 18,000 attack methods. Also the integration, optionally if you want, into threat intelligence platforms that you can kind of bring that data into. The second component to that is the integration with the vulnerability management, right? Again, the Qualys, Rapid7, or Tenable, bringing in those scan results, what patches are missing, and bringing that into the mix, and then tying it all together with that business risk, right? As we were just talking about, what are the crown jewels? What are the attack methods or groups that I'm most worried about? So that we can kind of multiply these things together by patch and by asset to really understand the risk and kind of give you, hey, I need to work on this first before I work on these other things to protect myself the most. Right. So again, it's the SafeBreach simulators and the SafeBreach integrations that are going to bring that all together for you and make that much easier to do. Again, as we mentioned earlier, our platform does a lot more things. We can test, malware. We can test email. We can test different attack methods so that you can understand, hey, is my security controls working today? My firewall, my antivirus, all the other security tools that I have in my environment, and do that, live in your production environment, but do it safely with our representation model. Right? And then we can give you that data, because it's going to be a lot of data in some cases, right? So that you can really understand, what are my next steps? What are my next steps to remediate maybe a change in the firewall? Or what are my next steps to start deploying patches and the priority with that? And then also tie in a remediation plan so that you can get this data into the other tools if you need to kind of do that correlation between the events. And then you can always, again, rerun the whole set of attack methods and what we call a plan to verify that everything is now working. We don't have time for a demo today, but if you would like to get a demo, please reach out to the ASMGi team and they can set up a call for that. So let's go ahead and move into the Q&A section. Steve, are there any questions?
There are, and a lot of really good questions, quite honestly. But I want to thank you and Mansoor for just a wonderful presentation, and hopefully that's resonating with some folks in the audience. But I wanted to, we'll kind of dig into the questions and we'll try to get through as many as we can. But the first question, I think, do you use CVEs to risk rate vulnerabilities? So why doesn't SafeBreach take a pass at this and just explain, like, how do you come up with a risk rating for a vulnerability, and do you leverage the vulnerabilities platform CVE rating?
Yeah, so the CVE rating, and obviously, that's kind of an international board here that kind of gives you that regardless of the vendor. So we bring in that information. As we kind of touched on a couple of times, the actual vendor has different vulnerabilities and which one is more critical than the others. So we're bringing all of that data in, plus we're mapping that data to the attack methods so that we really understand that, hey, this one has to go through a firewall, or it has to come out from inside the network, and therefore it's going to pass through a firewall, to bring and kind of mash all those things together, right? So it's really around that correlation that's going on with there. So absolutely, we use that CVE data to kind of give you that score.
Yep. And then could you give some details, Peter, on what your score looks like? Is it a 1 to 5? Is it a 1 to 10? Or is it a 1 to 100? Or is it A through Z? How do you actually, what do you end up with it for a risk score?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Mansoor had a slide on that he touched on real quick. And it's a shame that we didn't have time for a demo, because seeing that live would really kind of help that. Because the thing with the risk score is that it does depend on each organization and what their business concerns are. So what we have built in here is a system with sliders, so that you can really kind of like tweak a couple different settings and really understand, okay, if I'm not so concerned about this, or I'm more concerned about that, I can move it up, move or lower those sliders to get that risk score for your organization, for what your business concerns are. So there is a number that's going to tell you what you need to do, but again, you can start right in the middle, or you can start tweaking those, right, and really tie it to something a little bit more subjective, like your business concerns, and get a more accurate kind of number and priority.
Yep. Awesome. Excellent. So then there's a question, it's somewhat related to that, but how do you prioritize vulnerabilities? Dave, why don't you take a pass at that, and maybe you can share a little bit about what you do at the Judge Group.
So we had to make certain assumptions, and I don't want that to sound like a bad term. So for example, in order to manage the workload, we just said, if a vulnerability comes out and it's for a domain controller, it just gets applied. We don't have to test it. We don't have to sandbox it. We don't have to do anything like that. If it's for a firewall, we're big with standardized builds. Every location that we have has a standardized build, and everybody is on the same rev of every OS, whatever's out there, it's all the same. And we have a satellite office that we use as a test bed. So for example, if a firewall patch comes out, we have a smaller satellite office. We just apply the patch there, and then we can test in real time.
Yeah, so, what do they think about that, Dave?
Well, they're usually pretty good with getting offline at 5 o'clock, and they go home. It's a turnkey operation. But when it comes to the application side, that's where we have to set up the sandboxes, move the servers with dependencies on SQL into the sandboxes, and then it becomes a little bit more onerous getting the developers to be the true application owner and step up and get to the point where they're actually able to test the application patches. So that's why we're looking for a tool to give us insight and let us make more intelligent conversations, because the workload just keeps increasing and we're not doing anything to manage it intelligently. We're treating it with the deference it deserves. We are applying the patches, but we don't want to have to make any more assumptions anymore. We want to be able to make more intelligent decisions.
Yep. I think you hit on a lot of really, really important aspects there. Dave, it's hard. Prioritizing vulnerabilities is challenging, and it's challenging
without
because
without a standardized build, I don't know how you would do it.
Right, right. Yeah, there's no question. And there are enterprises who are running all kinds of versions of various different things. And, SharePoint comes to mind because I just had a conversation about that. But most enterprises that deploy, software like that have a lot of versions that are implemented. There's no question. And I just wanted to add, like we do a lot, we'll talk about this a little bit in a summary slide, but, we talk about a total solution at ASMGi as a program plus the technology plus the operations, but a lot of the programs that we look at as it relates to vulnerability management, they're heavily dependent on the CVE scale, and it's kind of a one size fits all. And I think Peter and Mansoor, you addressed this earlier in your slides as well, right? Just because the vulnerability package says it's a 5 doesn't mean it'll get the same priority in this kind of risk-based vulnerability management model. And I think that's critical. And a lot of the programs that are out there, like the SLAs, they're solely based on CVEs. And, we work with a lot of programs that say, hey, you got 30 days or 45 days for 4s and 5s to get them remediated, right? And the volume keeps going up. You still have the same amount of time to get them done, right? That's it's challenging. They don't really consider the actual risk in a lot of cases, right? The programs and the SLAs that are designed to address that. So I think it's a critical distinction that we can't really depend on that old model. As it relates to vulnerability management, I know that vulnerability management programs have been, and the CVE rating system has been around for a long time. And I think that, it's time for an evolution. And if that's not just driven by volume or what have you, there's just too many vulnerabilities, right? So we have to prioritize them, and I think it's a key point, and very well addressed here. So I'll move on. I'll keep moving on the question front. So does the SafeBreach console include the scanning software? So clearly a SafeBreach question. Peter, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, good clarification there. So we have an integration to the different products. Right now, again, it's Tenable, Rapid7, and Qualys. And all of our integrations are included at no extra charge. But you do need to own the license, the software license to one of those products. So you definitely need to have that. And I know that Steve and your team can help with that.
Indeed we can. And just so everybody on the call knows, we are partners with most of the primary enterprise vulnerability management system. So if you need a scanner, by all means, we can help you with that. But SafeBreach does a really good job of, to Peter's point, having built-in integrations included, right? Included at no extra fee. So that's awesome. Thanks for that, Peter. Simulator. So how many simulators are needed by SafeBreach?
Yeah, I'll take that. This is Peter speaking here. As kind of Mansoor kind of showed in his diagram there, you want to start with the operating systems, right? So we support the Windows operating systems, both Windows 7, Windows 10, the Windows Server operating systems, the Mac OS, and the Linux, right? And again, both for desktop and server on the Linux side. So you definitely want to have represent each of your operating systems first. And then secondly, you want to look at those into those segments or zones, right? Look at those users, look at by location, look at the different server areas that you have. And then the other key thing, as we talked about earlier, is also those crown jewel areas, right? Where is the most impact to my business that I want to make sure is working correctly, and also have simulators into that environment too. So that's kind of the way you determine the number. Minimum of 10 is probably a starting point. We see a lot of organizations using 20 or more for their environment, depending on how big and complex it is.
Awesome. So I think, one of the key things that I heard you say, Peter, and I know from your platform, it's just important. It depends, right? That's always the answer, it seems, but you really have to take a look at how your network is architected and how many versions. To your point, Dave, if you're running a standardized, version, Windows 10, for example, then that's a simulator just for that environment. If you have multiple versions, then potentially you need more simulators to cover that and what have you. So, but I think that's a discussion that we would have, and it would be unique to you. It wouldn't be the same for every company. It would be different in each time. I'm going to keep going through these questions because we have a whole bunch of them. So what do you recommend as ways to deal with managing false negative risk? So I'm going to kick this over to SafeBreach first, and then Dave, if you have anything to add to that. But false negative risk, how do you manage that?
Peter, do you want to take that one?
Yes, please.
Excellent. So, Steve, the best way I would explain it is the key here is SafeBreach is running simulations in your environment and validating your controls, right? So we know for a fact if your control is able to detect the latest threat against our simulation, okay? And marrying that data, the data that we're fetching from the vulnerability management solution, like Rapid7, Tenable, or Qualys, taking that data together, it greatly reduces the risk of false negative, because we know for a fact, right, that hey, this particular vulnerability, it is exploitable because your control did not pick it up in your environment. So that's how our approach to risk and managing the false negative.
Yep. And maybe a little bit of interpretation required based on the question. So if maybe we can follow up with you and dig in on this a little bit, but like when we do vulnerability programs, some of our customers have their own scanners, right? So they send us the report, and a lot of times the vulnerability has been remediated and it may still show up on the report, right? And so we have to do an investigation and understand that. I would call that that's a false positive. So a false negative would be not showing up on the report when there's actually a vulnerability there. And where I would go based on the SafeBreach platform is running a simulation. You don't have to just run simulations against vulnerabilities that show up. You would put a simulator in place and you would run simulations anyway, right? So a false negative would be it didn't show up on the vulnerability scan, but you found it with the exploitability factor anyway. So again, like I said, I think maybe we can drill into that a little bit. Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I don't sleep much as it is, and now that I have to consider false negatives. Now, the way I look at it is you have to trust in the integrity of the systems that you purchase, and the integrity is what you have to rely on. I don't have the resources to investigate every single possible false negative that comes along. But that said, this tool here looks like if I can run as many simulations as I want, that would be a big step in remediating any false negatives.
Excellent. Agreed. So here's another question. Does the integration with the vulnerability management system tell you what simulation to run? SafeBreach, you want to take a crack at that one?
No. So we don't tell you which simulation to run, right? So the idea is you want to run simulations based on your requirement. We have over 17,000 plus attacks in our environment. You want to run the simulation first, and then remember, we're post-exploit. We're not testing each vulnerability. So the idea is run the simulation and then pulling the data in from your vulnerability management solution. We can help you take the data and give you a score on which asset is most exposed in your environment.
So just a follow-on question to that, then how do you know if you have 17,000 simulations, like how do you know what to run?
So we have 17,000 simulations based on the main four phases, right? Infiltration, exfiltration, host-based, and lateral movement. Those are the four main categories that from penetration testing. We have all these simulations available in our playbook. Okay, so it goes back to the point is, what are you looking to test? Are you looking to test infiltration in your environment? Then you would literally, you can filter infiltration, and you have thousands of attacks available within infiltration, right? And the second part of that, the first phase is pick the phase you want to run it against. Number one. Then number two would be, okay, are you looking to test out a specific control? Are you looking to test out a specific port or protocol and so forth? And then you start filtering those down, and the platform has the filter, all of those filters created for you. So you can start filtering those down, and then you'll be left with, out of the 17,000, here's a handful of number of attacks that you want to run in your environment. That's the best way to approach it. It's based on your use case. What do you want? What are you looking to test in your environment?
Yep, excellent.
If you're looking to test the latest threat, right, all you have to do is, you don't have to know the phase. You can just type the name of that threat. And we have a SLA with our customers that within 48 hours, and when the new threat comes out, a US cert comes out, we'll have that threat safely reverse engineered, available for our customers to test.
Yep. And that's a great benefit, and I think it's worth reiterating. 48-hour SLA, right? So if US Cert announces, and this happened actually with the domain controller, Dave, you mentioned, the criticality of deploying fixes, remediation to domain controllers. You don't even, worry about it. You just do it, right? But there was a Microsoft domain controller vulnerability that US Cert.
Zero logon one.
Pardon me?
Zero logon one.
Right.
Yeah.
So US Cert talked about it within 48 hours. SafeBreach has that incorporated into their playbook, right? Into their attack playbook, and so there is a simulation that you can run to find out if people can exploit you. That's
an interesting one, Stephen. Maybe it talks to the false negative, because that net logon algorithm is not actually fixed. What they've done is they've issued a temporary fix to the algorithm, and the true fix comes out in the February 2021 Microsoft patch.
So there you have it. You can have compensating control. So this is the other thing that an attack simulation will help you visualize, right? Compensating controls can stop an exploitation. So there is a temporary fix to your point. Great points for sure. Another question. I'm just going to try to keep moving through these so we can try to get to all of them. Can you simulate a ransomware attack?
The answer is yes. We have hundreds of ransomware, all the different variants that are available in the wild, right? Those attacks are available in the playbook, like Jeff Ransomware, ProLocker, WannaCry, all the different versions of these ransomware attacks, from host-based to email. All of those are available in the SafeBreach playbook.
Excellent. Yep, excellent. Here's a question, and Dave, maybe you can start on this answer. How do you know which controls to implement first? That's a tricky one.
Well, actually, it's not, because what I did, Steve, was I took an approach where you can go get ISO certified, you can get high trust CSF certified. So what we did was we went the route of the high trust CSF. And the reason we chose that framework was because they're very proactive with integrating other frameworks into the high trust CSF framework. And as long as we're in step with, I think we're up to version 9.4, and we just finished our second certification with high trust, they're very good at keeping you up to date with what you need to be doing to keep your certification and your framework up to date. So again, it comes down to that kind of partnership. Pick your partners, make sure you're using the right partner, and that your partner is actually as committed to the process as you. And we found that high trust CSF, although it's very laborious to get done, is a tremendous framework to subscribe to. And those controls are what we rely on for our for the core of our cybersecurity plan.
Yep. Yeah, that's nice. And I'm going to reflect on another question that was asked, because and SafeBreach, maybe you can address this, but I think it really ties into this question. Are there other use cases for simulations? And, Peter, you talked about that a little bit in the presentation, but as it relates to controls, I think it's a great lead into that. Are there other simulations that you can do with your platform?
No, absolutely. Yeah. As we were saying, we're approaching 18,000 different attack methods, and we have broken these down into different groups, right? So you could be worried about, your endpoint. You could be worried about email. You could be worried about, people getting data in or getting data out of your network. So a lot of different ways that you can break down those simulations. We also touched on a little bit of the MITRE framework, and another great way to kind of measure what's going on in your environment and understand what is working or not working, and kind of an industry standard that way. So yeah, that's just another example. So we definitely have the full support for the MITRE framework, and then a lot more, right? So again, by different categories, by different threat groups. So it's almost an endless list of possibilities.
Yep. Yep. I'm going to reflect on both of these at the same time, because we see this a lot. Like, we live and breathe frameworks and best practices and those kind of things all day long, with a GRC practice and a cyber operations practice and those kind of things. So it's in no way do I want to minimize the effectiveness of frameworks, right? I think it's critically important that people adopt frameworks for guidance and those kind of things. And as we all know, if it's a compliance requirement that's dictating, you have to have certain controls in place, it's an absolute requirement, right? There's no question about all of that. But what I get excited about from an attack simulation standpoint is being able to validate that the controls actually work, right? So I see a lot of enterprises that they just move. We call it a point solution mentality, right? They just move from one control to the next control to the next control, go buy a piece of technology, put it in place, move on to the next project, right? And if you talk to security departments today, like, boards and executive teams are putting a lot of pressure on CISOs and practitioners to protect us from the bad guys, right? From harm, quite honestly. And there's so many things to do. Like, how do you even know what to do first, right? So what I like about attack simulation as a use case, in addition to vulnerability management, it's very exciting to be able to do a risk-based approach to vulnerability management. But in addition to that, just validating controls, I think, is critically important. So that people can know for sure, for certain, right, that a control that's put in place is actually working. It's actually effective. And I think it's a critical point to make. And I'm just going to keep moving on we have a couple more slides, believe it or not, as follow-up. But I just wanted to summarize the point. Thank you, everybody, again, for being a part of this and sharing your time with us today, and for the panel for your expert input and various different things. I just wanted to summarize kind of the key points that were made today, and then just turn it over to everybody for some closing remarks. So I think, and again, I'll go through all of these, and then I'll just open it up to the other panelists for closing remarks. But from my perspective, the key takeaways were that the number of vulnerabilities are increasing, and it's at a very fast pace, quite honestly, right? But at the same time, the amount of time that it takes to actually exploit a vulnerability is decreasing. So that is a very scary fact. Point number 2, it's not practical to assume that we can just simply remediate everything. So the best approach then, in light of that, is to first prioritize, basically first remediate those vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And I think that's a valid, critical point to make. And then simulating attacks is the best way to prioritize your vulnerabilities, because how would you know, without actually, getting ransomware or getting compromised, how would you actually know whether your controls are working or not, right? So if you simulate your attacks, that's how you know if a vulnerability is actually exploitable, by running a simulation against it. So I think that's an important takeaway as well. And then lastly, just the risk-based vulnerability management, it takes all of these things into consideration. So I think it's a great evolution from a vulnerability management program standpoint. Let me just open it up. Dave, why don't we start with you? Just open it up for closing remarks or any thoughts.
My closing remarks would be this. Don't look at your controls and at your solutions that you have in place as a finished article. Technologists have a trend to fall in love with what they put in place, which is why I'm not very popular around here, because I may have had an engineer who spent a long time putting in a solution 3 years ago, 2 years ago, a year ago. It may be there's an obsolescence factor. So stressing the fact for the need for evolution in a system, a product, and an approach is what's going to keep you secure. And that's ultimately, we'll be taking a strong look at SafeBreach and see how that helps us evolve our roadmap for security.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Mansoor.
Sure. I would sum it up this way, right? The key here is the numbers are right in front of us. So there's overabundance amount of vulnerabilities coming out, right? How do you keep up? Right, the approach, the risk approach that SafeBreach is proposing of looking at the prioritize what is most critical to you, by approaching that angle, it was definitely help prioritize, making your environment secure, and you're doing it efficiently. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Steve.
Excellent. Peter, closing remarks.
Yeah, so the key thing here is to think about, as your own organization, what's important to you. You want to make sure that you're safe and secure, and there are many ways of doing that. You got to patch, you got to get some more details, and SafeBreach can help with that. And also, working with a great partner like ASMGi to help you with these situations is another key thing that you want to consider.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for those kind words, and thank you all for your participation. Just one final thought as a takeaway. Real quick, I wanted to talk about, ASMGi's one team service. So one of the things, some of you might be wondering is like, how do we actually do these things? And I just wanted to share real quickly. We think there's a transition, from an old way of doing things, which is a point solution mindset, right? It's reactive by nature, focusing on individual controls. It can tend to be fragmented and inefficient. And what we see in a lot of enterprises is a lot of spend and not necessarily an improvement on security posture, right? So replace that with a new way of thinking, right? More of a holistic security approach or mindset, right? It's more proactive in nature. I'm focused on total solutions, and I'll drill in on that in a second. But it's both gap-based and risk-based, and by that I mean fill the gaps that exist and use a tool like an attack simulation tool to show you where those gaps exist, and also to help you prioritize based on true risk, right? Exploitability and those kind of things. And at the end of the day, what that results in is spending less and actually having an impact on your security posture and lowering your risk. So the one team service, as I talked about, we have a definition called a total solution. We say this about every single piece of technology out there, and I tell this story to enterprises all the time. It's not a total solution if it doesn't include a program plus a technology stack plus the operations. So those I think are key points. And I want to just thank everybody for your participation today. And thank you so much, SafeBreach, for all your wisdom, and Dave for joining us today. And thank you for your insights.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.